Good evening. I'm Mike Feuer, Majority Policy Leader of the California State Assembly. I represent the 42nd Assembly District, which extends from Brentwood to Los Feliz and Beverly Hills to beyond Sherman Oaks. I'm very privileged to represent many of you attending this important conference, as I did when I served on the Los Angeles City Council. Unfortunately, I can't attend this wonderful event in person, but I must support the hotel employees' efforts to improve their working conditions. I'm proud to have a long history with the Iranian American community. When I directed Bet Tzedek Legal Services, I worked with the Iranian American Jewish Federation to assist small business owners to get back on their feet after the civil unrest in Los Angeles. In my first legislative session, I co-authored AB 221, bipartisan legislation that prohibits the investment of public employee retirement funds in companies that have energy or defense-related operations in Iran. It's been an honor to have participated in 30 years after since its formation. 30 years after, it continues to make tremendous contributions to the Iranian American Jewish community, to Los Angeles, and to the state of California. This year, along with Assemblymember Bob Blumenfield, I co-authored AB 1650, the Iran Contracting Act of 2010, which prohibits contracts of $1 million or more between the state of California and companies with significant business in Iran's energy sector. The new law ensures that California's tax dollars do not go to companies whose investments support Iran's nuclear program, exportation of terror, and brutal suppression of internal dissent. California is the first state in the nation to enact legislation under a new federal law that will limit Iran's ability to make nuclear weapons. Our state will lead the nation in encouraging companies to reject investments in Iran's energy sector. I particularly want to thank members of 30 Years After for your tireless advocacy of this critical legislation. Your efforts played a major role in convincing the legislature to pass this measure with bipartisan support and in persuading the governor to sign it into law. Now, I'm pleased to share with you a video clip of one of the hearings held on AB 1650, where Bob and I made the case to our colleagues for why this legislation is urgently needed. I hope you have a successful and productive conference and send you my best wishes now and for the future.
So why now? Why are we coming forward with this bill now? For several reasons. One, because of the urgency of the timing, and we're talking about an existential threat. We're talking about stability in the Middle East and potentially in our own country. But also because right now the Congress is also moving in a way. Now, Congress has moved on this issue, and I was involved with that back in 1996. I was on staff with Congressman Berman when he authored the ILSA, the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act, which became the Iran Sanctions Act. But that helped to some extent create some sanctions and some pressure on the regime, but the regime is more dangerous than it ever has been. Congress at this point is moving forward on several bills that have already passed the House and the Senate, and these bills would not only increase the sanctions that the federal government is putting in, but for the first time they are expressly allowing states to take an action that we may or may not have been able to take before under current law. And specifically, that action is to say that no contract that any government entity enters into will be with a company that is doing business with the Iranian petroleum oil sector. And it's defined as companies doing more than $20 million worth of business, and there's a number of strict definitions. The same definitions that are in the federal bill, we are tracking in this state bill. So this bill is to both send a message and have a real impact on companies, on foreign companies, that are doing business with the Iranian petroleum oil sector. And the reason why it's targeted to foreign companies is because U.S. companies are already not allowed to do this under the law. So right now, there's no level playing field. You have a situation where U.S. companies cannot interact with the Iranian regime, and foreign companies, some of them are, and our tax dollars are potentially subsidizing these kinds of things. This bill is an effort to say no, enough is enough, and to force these large companies to make a choice. They either stand with the 8th largest economy in the world and they work with our business, or they can take their marbles and go to a terrorist regime that's going to be sanctioned by the U.S. Even further and contribute to the destabilization of the entire world.
Thanks, Mr. Blumenfield. So, you know, as recently as this week, we have seen Iran move in an increasingly belligerent way. We know on Friday, for example, it declared itself a nuclear state. So why are we bringing a bill that relates to international affairs here to the California legislature, particularly at a time when we're facing so many crises? I personally am not a fan of such bills under many circumstances. This is different. It's different for a couple specific reasons. First of all, as Mr. Blumenfield indicated, the nature of the threat is much more severe internationally. Second of all, this is an opportunity for us not to be creating a foreign policy, but to be accepting the invitation of Congress to act as it is suggesting other cities and states across the country can act, to bolster federal policy, to replicate federal policy at the state level. That's what this bill is about. It's about acting consistently with our national interest, and as Mr. Blumenfield indicated, we are the 8th largest economy in the world, and I think many of us recognize there are moments when California can play a role that's not only intrinsically important, but has a catalytic effect in inspiring action in other states and indeed internationally. If a country the size of a middle-sized European country like Italy were to take an action like this, it would send reverberations around the world. We can do the same here in this chamber today. Now, in terms of the mechanics of the bill, as Mr. Blumenfield indicated, this, consistent with federal rules, would say if you are a company engaged in $20 million or more of business in Iran's energy sector, you face the choice that Mr. Blumenfield indicated. You either continue that engagement with Iran in helping fuel, literally, their nuclear ambition, their internal descent of suppression, there's suppression of dissent, and their effort to export terror elsewhere, or you stand with the vast array of international view regarding what's important in terms of stabilizing international security. Lastly, this is a bill that allows for changed behavior. In fact, it encourages changed behavior. It says to the companies affected that if you choose to disengage from Iran's energy sector, then you will be permitted to contract with California and its subdivisions. It's a way to work consistently with best economic policy. So with this in mind, we urge your strong support. We appreciate the bipartisan support this measure has engendered. Mr. Tran, who's just joined us, is a co-author, as are Mr. Jeffries, Mr. Anderson, and others, support on both sides of the aisle. And Mr. Bloomfield, I do want to accept the technical amendments proposed by the staff to move that as well. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Assemblymember Bob Blumenfield. I'm a big fan of 30 Years After, and therefore I'm really disappointed that I can't be with you in person this evening for this great event. Please know that while I'm not standing right there in person because of the labor strike, I stand with you in solidarity and stand with you in your mission. First, I'd like to congratulate you for all of the impressive strides that you've made on behalf of the Iranian-American Jewish community, raising awareness of issues, educating your membership and the public, and most importantly, engaging in the civic debates of our time. A perfect example of the power of activism is the outstanding work 30 Years After did in supporting and advocating for AB 1650, the Iran Contracting Act of 2010. That's the bill that I jointly authored with Assemblymember Mike Feuer. In working for passage of this bill, we faced some very formidable opposition from a small but powerful group of interests that didn't want to see the status quo disrupted in any way. In the end, we were able to overcome their opposition and gain bipartisan support in the legislature. And finally, we got a signature by the governor to make it into law. But we could not have succeeded in our efforts without the partnership of 30 Years After and other groups standing with us, pushing this policy. 30 Years After was a dependable ally, and your advocacy at legislative hearings, at sending letters to make our presence known, by attending press conferences, and all of the other outreach that we did together to raise visibility about the bill is what helped make a show of strength that was needed to get the job done. I know about the power of activism and civic involvement firsthand. I've only been in elected office for 2 years, and it was not that long ago that I was an activist like you working with nonprofit groups to effect positive change in our community. Now that I'm able to use the skills that I developed in the trenches as I make policy in Sacramento, I want to let you know that what you're doing is extremely important to those efforts. The great thing about being the 8th largest economy on the planet is that when California does something new, other states and countries tend to take notice and often follow suit. And that's just what's happening with this bill, AB 1650. We've seen other states and localities take up this same cause, and in time, we will not only have marshaled our own state's economic power against the tyrannical regime in Iran, but we will have exponentially increased our effectiveness by adding other governmental entities to the list who shun companies with ties to Iran. I hope you have a successful and productive conference, and I really send you my best wishes now and in the future. Thank you.